everybody. And let me start by thanking Scott and Heather for putting this all together. It's quite a chore, and I am, from a technology standpoint, pretty limited. And they've been really graceful and supportive, and I hope I can remember their instructions as we proceed. I'm going to just share with you a few basic ideas that kind of govern my work. I think of them as the foundation stones of my work. And some of you who have heard me in the past, apologies, it's going to be a repeat for you, I'm sure. But I heard from Scott and Heather that about half of you may not have heard me before. So I want to share some ideas, some sort of essential things. A way I think about them is they're the things that, as I come up on retirement, things that I would want to pass on. There's a bunch of stories or information I'd love to pass on, but these are the essential things, the essential lessons of my work life. So I'm going to share with you a few slides, and hopefully this is going to work. Let me go back a slide, I think. First, the website that Scott was mentioning, this is the address, deimagine.com. And you're welcome to go there. Throughout this presentation, I may mention resources that are available if you'd like to use them, handouts you can download. For example, everything on my site, if it comes from me, is free, and you're more than welcome to take a look. I'll also share later in this presentation some resources, some websites that I have found to be helpful and think you will too. So hold on for that. If I had to boil it all down to what I think is the most critical, it is that relationships are at the core of our happiness and our well-being. We are social species, and ours is a social brain. I had an experience when I first entered this field 40 years ago. I was 24 years old. I was a political science undergraduate, which should tell you I was unemployed. And actually, I wasn't unemployed. I was working at a beer and magazine store, and a friend of mine came into the store and told me that she was working at the state hospital in Vermont and asked me if I'd like to visit there and see what she does for work. And I thought, sure, what the heck. And the next thing I knew, I was signing my name on a contract, and I became overnight a child development specialist. It's so funny to me, in our field, we have fancy ways of describing what we do, but sometimes they just defy what we actually do. But I was a child development specialist in a program that was very behavioral. In fact, I would earn my master's degree in special education through this program, and it was very much about behavior analysis. And I worked at a place called the Youth Treatment Center, and one of the children, they were all children who lived there, was this boy, Roland. He was 14 at the time. And Roland had a significant history of trauma in his life, which I knew nothing of at the time. But he would go on to be one of my great teachers. And in particular, a remarkable thing happened. I started in January of 1979, and in December of that year, I was working the late shift and went home to my little house just up the road from the state institution. And when I came back from my supper break, I walked around the youth treatment center just saying hi to the different kids that lived there, Roland being one of them. But Roland was nowhere to be found. His door was open. I asked people, where's Roland? And no one knew. And then I noticed that the back door that led outside was open and the cold air was rushing in. So I got my coat and went outside looking for him, and I could see his footprints in the snow. It was snowing pretty heavily. Excuse me. And I started just following on foot his footsteps, his tracks, and realized he had gotten some distance. So I went back and got my car. And in my car, I was now following his tracks down the center of the road in Waterbury. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, where is he going? And he was actually heading to my apartment, to my little house I lived in. I paid $55 a month in rent. I'll never forget it. He was heading towards my place. And I came across this bridge in Waterbury, and there he was walking down the middle of the street in a big snowstorm. He didn't have a coat on. He was just chugging right along. And I pulled my car over and I said, Ro, where are you going? And he said to me, David's house. So he was coming to see me. And I remember realizing in that moment, in that space and time, that Roland cared about me and that I cared about him. I think it was the first time in my life I ever had this realization that I was maybe needed by someone else other than a family member, that I might be able to help someone, that they cared about me and that I cared about them. I remember it's like time stood still for me. I was really struck by it. I remember standing there. Here I am, 24 years old. I have no idea what I'm doing with my life, really. But I remember standing out there in the snow and thinking to myself, this means something. I don't know what it means, but it means something. This is an important moment in my life. And it would go on to shape the work I do. I invited Roland, by the way, to come to my little house to have some hot chocolate. I called the state hospital and told them he's here with me. And that was the start of a really important relationship on lots of levels. For me, Roland would be one of my great teachers. It stayed with me the entire time, this event, following Roland and his snowy tracks. It stayed with me for a very long time. I knew it mattered. I knew it meant something, but it would really come to shape pretty much how I see the work that I do and what the work I do is about. What we know now is that humans are social beings, and ours is a social brain. It's hardwired for social relationships in ways that are just remarkable. The more scientists learn about our brain, the more compelling is the evidence that we're really pretty much hardwired for social connection. A study I love to share with people, and I probably shared with you, I know I've shared with some of you, is a study conducted in 2003 by a neuroscientist named Naomi Eisenberger. Eisenberger this study is based on a really simple idea, but it would revolutionize the neurosciences and our understanding of the human brain. And it's actually based on a study that was conducted in the 1970s by a researcher who asked people to come to his laboratory to fill out a questionnaire. He told them that the questionnaire was about something like job satisfaction or something, but actually there was no questionnaire. It was just a trick to get people to come to his laboratory. And when people arrived, they were told by a receptionist to please have a seat in the waiting room. The researcher or one of his associates will be with you shortly. And so people went to the reception area, and sitting there were two people who were pretending to be there to fill out a questionnaire, but they actually worked for the researcher. And you can imagine yourself arriving and everybody sort of nodding at each other like we do in waiting rooms. And they're lying beside one of the people working for the researcher, pretending to be there to fill out a questionnaire, was a Nerf ball or a rubber ball. And they pretend to notice it for the first time and reach down to pick it up. And then they throw it to the other person working for the researcher and say, "Are you here to fill out the questionnaire?" And the other says, "Yes, I am. Where are you from?" "Oh, I live in Blacksburg." "Oh, do you?" "Yes." "Oh, I live in Radford." "Oh, do you?" "Yeah, that's close by, isn't it?" And then they toss the ball to the person actually being studied and say, "How about you? Are you here to fill out the questionnaire?" And they say, "Yes, I am." "And where are you from?" "Oh, actually, I grew up in New England, in Vermont." "Oh, did you? Lovely this time of year, I understand." And so it's really just a conversation, sort of small talk between three people about really nothing at all. But after about 5 minutes, the two people working for the professor who were pretending to be there to fill out a questionnaire, they started to toss the ball back and forth and talk to each other. And they left the third person, the one actually being studied, they left them out of the conversation. And what the researcher was interested in is, would the person who's left out have a reaction? I mean, after all, it's just small talk. Why would anybody care? But what they found is that people not only had a reaction, they had a very strong reaction. When they were finally called in to fill out the fake questionnaire, they were, many of them, hot under the collar. They said things like, "You're not going to believe what happened. People are so rude these days. When I grew up, we had manners." What the researcher would write about later is the strength of people's reaction. It was much stronger than he expected. Well, now fast forward several decades, and a young neuroscientist, she's in her graduate training, Naomi Eisenberger, she reads this study and it sticks with her. She can't get it out of her mind. And later, when she's full-time neuroscientist with a laboratory and research dollars at her disposal, she decides to carry that study that was conducted by that researcher in the 1970s one step further. And what she did is she asked people, "Would you come to my laboratory?" And she asked them to play a game called Cyberball, an electronic version of the game of toss. It couldn't be a simpler game to learn, apparently. You click a button and toss an electronic ball to someone who clicks a button to catch it. And then they click a button to toss it to someone else, and so forth. Just like a game of toss, but using a mouse, a computer-generated game. But Eisenberger asked them to do this while laying down on a thing called a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, fMRI. She puts over their head a monitor and into their hands a clicking device. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these machines, or maybe you've been on one, but maybe you've seen an advertisement for a local hospital where someone lays on a flat bed with their neck propped up and they're submerged into a tunnel. And those machines create a strong gravitational force around the individual. So Eisenberger said, "Would you play the game while laying on this bed?" And then she tells them a fib. She tells them that they're going to be playing the game with two other people in the laboratory. Turns out it's not true. It's just going to be them and a computer. But Eisenberger wants them to believe that they'll be playing with actual people. And before the game even begins, many of the participants said out loud things like, "Oh, I'm terrible at these video games. I have no eye-hand coordination. My kids are great at these games, but I'm terrible." Before the game even begins, what they're expressing out loud is that they are afraid they're going to embarrass themselves socially. They're afraid they're going to embarrass themselves in front of the other two players because they won't get it quickly. They're afraid they're going to embarrass themselves in front of the researchers who will be watching. Before the game even begins, that's what they express. Well, Eisenberger and her associates tell them, "Oh, not to worry. We just want to see what the brain does when playing one of these electronic games. You can't mess it up. Not to worry a bit." So one by one, people go into this tunnel. They're just asked to lay as still as they can while this machine scans their body. It's an amazing technology, by the way. It creates a strong gravitational force around the person, and for reasons I do not understand, when this happens, the hydrogen atoms in our cells line up differently than they normally do, and they give off a radio signal, hence fMRI, a radio signal that can be read as very strong or very weak or something in between. And then scientists using very sophisticated computers can create three-dimensional pictures like the one you see on your screen, where they can see in the depths of the brain things that you could not see with the naked eye. It's an incredible technology, and it's only getting more incredible with every passing day. So one by one, people go into this machine. They think they're playing this video game with two other people. It turns out they're not really other people. It's just a computer in them. And for about 5 minutes, they play. They pick it up quickly. It couldn't be easier to pick up. And the scientists watch their brains. And then after about 5 minutes or so, just like that study from the 1970s, the two other players, it's a computer, but the two other players toss the ball back and forth and leave the person who's actually being studied, leave them out. And that's what scientists do. They watch the brain. And you know what happens in brain after brain, person after person? Our brains respond in exactly the same way as our brain would respond if somebody punched you in the nose. It's not a similar reaction. It's an exactly the same reaction. A region of the brain, it's called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, fires away. And when it does, scientists know a lot of what's taking place in the body. Among other things, the brain is now sending into the bloodstream chemicals that are designed to reduce highly localized swelling. Now, no, our brains produce chemicals that get sent into our bloodstream on a regular basis that reduce general swelling in the body. But these chemicals are sent to very specific areas where we've just experienced an insult, like we've been punched in the nose or hit behind the leg with a board. This happens within seconds of being left out of a video game. You're playing with two people you don't even know who turn out not to be real people, but you don't know it. Just 5 minutes. Chemicals are sent into the bloodstream that are designed to reduce pain. You haven't been just physically insulted, but your brain-body complex is acting like you have been basically punched in the nose just after 5 minutes. The strength of this reaction surprised the researchers, but it made Eisenberger realize, boy, that's why people were so hot under the collar back in the 1970s when called into this laboratory. They were experiencing physical insult. They were experiencing being left out as being physically hurt. Eisenberger asked the question, well, geez, if this is how we respond when we're left out of a video game with people we don't even know, what would it be like if we knew them? What would it be like if we were actually in the same room with them and they left us out? She asked, what would it be like if we loved somebody and they didn't love us back? Or what would it be like if we loved someone who passed? Well, what researchers could show for the very first time is that being left out is experienced as physical pain within the body. Now, of course, we didn't need the researchers to tell us that. We've known that for 1,000 years. It's expressed in our storytelling, and songwriters write songs. I got an achy, breaky heart. We've known it forever, but this is the first time that science showed us the actual mechanisms for experiencing loss as physical pain in the body. Now, just interestingly, something I love to tell people is that a group of researchers from Harvard picked up on this result and said, well, doesn't it make sense if that's true that when people experience loss, they would do well if you just gave them aspirin, gave them a painkiller? And guess what? It turns out to be true. Now, the researchers from Harvard aren't saying not even for a moment, you've been You've just broken up with your boyfriend, take a couple of aspirin and you'll feel fine in the morning. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying you'll feel fine, but they are saying you'll feel better. The reason I like to tell people about this is because I think it's central to the lives of people with disabilities. What I've come to realize, what now makes a totally different kind of sense, is that loneliness is, as Beth Mount put it, the only real disability. When you have people in your life who love you and you love, you can get through just about anything that gets thrown at you. You'll have ups and downs, but your resilience, your capacity is significantly improved. The problem for a lot of people with disabilities, people like my friend Roland, is that they're disconnected from social relationships. They get separated sometimes from their primary relationships at an early age, and then as their brothers and sisters who might be typical in their development, if they do live at home, their brothers and sisters who might be typical in their development move on to a second family, it's sometimes called, friends and lovers, but their life gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I've come to believe it's the root of suffering for many people with disabilities. I think loneliness is the number one cause of problem behaviors, too. In my experience, loneliness is at the root of most human problems. It's not that we don't have problems for other reasons, it's just that isolation, social isolation, is the root of many, many problems for many people that I meet. So that's the first foundation stone. I believe that helping people to develop enduring positive relationships is the work of it. It's the most essential thing you can do for human beings whose source of the core of happiness and well-being is the development of enduring positive relationships. That has shaped my work and how I think about the work for years now. The second foundation stone of my work is central to all of this, is that many people experience in their bodies a level of anxiety that makes it really difficult to form connection with people. They have trouble reading social signals. They have trouble problem solving. They have problems retrieving things from their memory or projecting into the future because they are overwhelmed with anxiety. And I'm so sorry, I'm coughing here. And I've come to understand anxiety plays a big role in many things going on with us humans. When I first started to study anxiety, I assumed that anxiety was always a bad thing, but that turns out to be a myth. That in fact, a certain level of anxiety is associated with the highest level of performance. We need to be anxious, in short, for our brain to work well. Too little anxiety isn't good for us, and too much ain't good for us. I used to think that, geez, if we could just eliminate anxiety from our body, we'd be happy human beings. Sorry about that. But that turns out to be a myth. And it's expressed in this model, where at the bottom you see anxiety level. On the left, you would see low anxiety, not much at all. And on the right, you'd see high anxiety, lots and lots of anxiety. And up the vertical axis, you see performance. The bottom would be low performance, not doing things well. At the top would be high performance. And you can see by the shape of this curve that low anxiety is associated with low performance. This is what happens to some of us when we've had a busy week and we find ourselves on the couch, exhausted. We can't make decisions about even the simplest things like what kind of pizza should we order tonight. It's overwhelms us, we say, just order something, I don't care, I can't decide. But if you follow that line out a little bit to say where the letter A in anxiety is and go straight up, you see it's associated with an optimal level of performance. What researchers now know is that when we're a little bit anxious, our brain works better. We can problem solve better. We can read what's going on around us socially more effectively. We are more empathetic. We're able to problem solve and plan into the future with incredible amounts of accuracy if the anxiety is the right anxiety. You can see from this arrow that I've added to this chart is that the difference between the right amount of anxiety and too much just ain't much. A certain amount of anxiety in excess, we begin to fall off that slope. And in fact, if we get way out close to where it's high anxiety, what we know about people is that they physiologically disengage from the brain that problem solves. Literally, our prefrontal cortex is shut down by nature because we're experiencing a lot of threat. We can't make sense of the world. When we're way out there, we jump from thought to thought. We have difficulty remembering things that we've learned, and we have an extraordinary amount of difficulty projecting into the future, saying, if I did this, then some good things might happen, and I probably don't want to do that. The brain that allows us to engage in that kind of thinking gets shut down. I believe a lot of people we care about very much, they live way out on that edge where that arrow is. They live there. On a good day, they're more anxious than their bodies than many of us are on our worst days. This would explain why one little thing might not go right for the person, and the next thing you know, they're just falling off the face of the earth. We'll often say about people who are in that place that they have exaggerated responses to ordinary changes in the environment. I think a lot of people live on that edge. It's sort of like the tipping point or the straw that breaks the camel's back. A person is doing everything they can to keep themselves under control, and then one little thing doesn't go right, and the next thing you know, they're disengaging from the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. I also think, by the way, that lots of people who work in our profession have huge degrees of anxiety. And it makes it tough when you are to be flexible about things. You just think about how everybody is experiencing this time we live in now. It's one thing after another we have to worry about and think about that we didn't very long ago have to think about. So we're exhausted, we're wiped out. And if many of us are getting to the point already where if one more thing doesn't go well or go the way we want it to, it just feels like a breaking point. I think this anxiety can be cumulative. The stress associated with it can be cumulative, and many people are that we care about are living way out on that edge, and the people offering them support live on that edge as well. Humans, when they are struggling or experience a problem or a threat, they have three options available to them. The first is to reach out to other human beings, and biologically, this is by far the best response. Nature programs us to reach out to others. An example I like to use is that if suddenly into your living room right now or your conference room, a camera crew from the local television station were to show up and start filming you and asking you 1,000 questions, the first response you would have would be to look at people who you are familiar with, people you know, people sitting there with you in the living room. You'd reference yourself to them. You're programmed on a cellular level to seek input from a community of people. So the first strategy in nature for human beings when they face struggle is to reach out, to get help. And it is by far the best option for human beings. The second strategy is to act out, and if that fails sufficiently, to shut down. We have those three options: reach out, act out, or shut down. I think lots of people that I've met in my practice are doing a lot of this, the second and third strategy, acting out or shutting down, because they have not learned with it over time that reaching out is a really great option. When I worked in that institution where Roland lived, it was a very behavioral program we had, and we were taught not to respond to kids when they used problem behaviors to get our attention. I remember one time this kid named Hugh was out on this porch, and I came out to tell him it was time to do something, time for lunch or dinner or something. And he grabbed a arm off a wooden chair and smacked himself in the head with the wooden arm. And I had been trained when Hugh does these things to turn my back on him, to walk away, to not pay any attention, not to reinforce the behavior. It's one of those things that I'll never forgive myself for to this day. But think of the message I sent to Hugh, who needed to learn that reaching out was a good option. He acts out and I turn away. What I would want to do now is to be as supportive as possible. First, help him to not hurt himself, and then check in with him and find out what he needs and how can I be nurturing, what can I do. Those are the options I wish when I first started doing this work I had learned, is that relationships are critical. Developing a relationship with them, being someone that it pays off to reach out to, is a really, really good thing to do. There are helpful things you might say. I wish I had learned to say when someone is upset and comes to me, saying simple things like, thanks for bringing that to my attention, and I'm really proud of you. It's been a long time since that happened before, and man, this time you really calmed down quickly, are all things that help people to learn that reaching out is a really good strategy for human beings. I was taught at a time where we were told, don't reinforce this behavior, that we would make the problem worse, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. Now, in a second, I'm going to just check in with you to see if the things I'm talking about are making sense. I want to give back to the regular screen and check in with you, and if you could send any questions or thoughts or comments to Heather, that would be great. I just want to make sure this is all making sense, because I'm just sitting in my office looking at my computer screen, yapping away.
So for sure, if anybody has any questions, I know we have a list of questions, but if anybody has any questions or thoughts right now, certainly if you put them in the Q&A, I'll pull them up. Okay,
Yeah.
so I've got Kim who says this makes so much sense.
Good, thank you, Kim.
So we have one from Fundementals previously. Apologize for making a terrible attempt at her first name. But she had asked, in the midst of challenges, how do you cope? That might be both for that frontline experience for those of us when poo-poo hits the fan and everything's falling apart. The question might be for us as frontline workers: how do we cope, and what can you do to overcome anxiety?
Well, it's a really great question. First, remember that a certain amount of anxiety in your system is actually good for you. It actually enhances your ability to problem solve and empathize with others. It's just when it becomes too much, it causes the thinking brain, the part of the brain that can retrieve things from memory or help us think into the future. It also it inhibits the part of our brain that allows us to be empathetic to others. It shuts all these things down. For me, I was anxious about this broadcast, and for me, throughout my life, getting out and moving aerobically. So I just went for a short walk around our land about an hour ago. It really helps me to get myself centered. Part of how we experience anxiety in our bodies is we store it as energy. So it makes sense in nature that if something is threatening you or causing you a great deal of struggle, that it would create energy inside your body. And a big problem is that sometimes too much of that energy can really impact on your ability to think clearly about things. And a simple strategy, going for a walk or doing anything that's aerobic, can really settle down the physical body. It changes the carbon dioxide levels in the bloodstream and does all kinds of things that cause chemical reactions to happen in the brain that calm and soothe the brain. So you just get into a better space. But that's something I've learned for myself is really helpful. When I work alongside people with disabilities, a thing I learned over the years was to just sort of check in with myself before I begin work with people or supporting people, just to see how I'm doing. I just check in with myself and try to calm myself down. I talk to myself a little bit. I meditate a little bit. These things are really useful to me. It gets me into this place where I feel like I can be more available to whatever might happen. So I found that to be useful. One thing a guy named Al Vecchione taught me years ago, Al's a psychologist in Vermont. I'll share with you all a website that he developed that's just fabulous. But Al taught me to hold on to my first reaction. So when I meet people and they're upset, I often have a response. I want to make a response. And Al has taught me the skill of just checking in with that and holding on to it for a second and looking at it, reflecting on it and we're talking seconds. And ask myself, is this a helpful, good response next? Or might I try something different? And sometimes I end up doing exactly what I initially was compelled to do, and it turns out okay or not okay. But a good amount of the time, I find myself checking off what I might have done, what my first gut reaction was, and I'm sorry, and replacing it with another response that I think might be more helpful, and often it is more helpful than what I would have initially had done. A thing to know is that when you're supporting people who are anxious, I'm going to show this slide again. It's not uncommon for all of us to be out on that edge. And the work is to move ourselves back to a place where it's the optimal level of anxiety, where it's, you might call, right anxiety. But know that when we get particularly troubled by someone's reaction, we can lose ground and then leave the brain that can help us to problem solve. It makes sense, doesn't it, that if we get too anxious, the likelihood we'll make mistakes goes up dramatically, because we literally are leaving the brain that helps us to process what's going on and problem solve. So anything I found, anything I can do that gets me into a good space before I begin supporting people tends to pay off over time. But I have to be mindful about it. I can't just fly from thing to thing, and I need to get myself a little prepared up front. And the kinds of strategies that work for you might be different. Everybody's got, there's a million different great ways to get ourselves centered. And I just encourage you to find some ways that work for you and then practice them with routine.
Awesome. Thanks, David. We've also got Michelle, who said she loves the stories, David. And Gail says, this makes perfect sense. It's embarrassing that the way forward was just under our noses all the time. Perhaps we don't need a PhD to figure this out. Then Pamela said, brings back memories of working in the Howard E. Lawson Home for Retarded Children in the 1970s when they brought in a program of operant conditioning. Sounds like what David was taught in the 70s. Ignore bad behavior, notice and praise good behavior. And then Allison said, I love the concept of reach out, act out, and shut down when people are under stress or anxiety. That's really helpful to keep in mind. We had a question from someone who said, in the example you provided with the gentleman who was hitting his head with the wooden arm of the chair, what would or could have been the outcome if you hadn't walked away?
Well, thank you all for those comments. First, let me say that I did go through this very much training in operant, thinking about behavior being operant. And we are affected by the environment all the time, the external environment. There's no question about it. But we're also affected by our internal environment and our interpretation of what's happening in the external environment. A thing to know about us that I find really helpful way of thinking about it is that we're programmed on a cellular level to reach out. It is by far nature's desirable strategy. We're the social species, and basically the reason we're programmed on such a cellular level to reach out is because it increases our survival chances significantly as a species. We're a cooperative species. Our brain is a social brain because it really increased the likelihood of survival. Our ancestors, when they were wandering around on the Serengeti, they long-term survival depended on their ability to cooperate. We don't have a lot of fur on our bodies, so cold nights have to be spent sleeping together under the roots of trees or in caves, and some of us would sleep while others would keep an eye, be on the lookout for predators. That meant we had to trust each other significantly. We're very clever, our brains are very clever, but we're not particularly fast or strong, so learning to hunt in pack was critical to our survival. When we did find food, and we were more scavengers than we were actually hunters, it's sort of a myth that we were chasing down mammoths with spears, and it's not that we didn't do that, but more often than not, our ancestors found dead animals along the way and brought them back to the tribe to share. But sharing meant everybody needed to get something, but nobody could get too much. So cooperative behavior became really critical to the species' survival. It's the reason we're all here now, is our ancestors learned how to do that thousands of years ago. So on a cellular level, it's what we do, what we're programmed to do. It's not something you really have to teach the species, though how to do it gets reinforced through our experience in the environment. But this notion that, it's learned behavior is really a simplification. It's far more complicated than just simply learned behavior, where we're programmed down right to the cellular level. When you think about that Eisenberger study, here are people left out of a video game and their brain responds like they've been punched in the nose. What the scientists said at that point is they said, boy, a reaction, any reaction that is this strong, that's this laid down, has survival implications. We don't lay down in our central nervous system patterns of behavior like this unless they help us as a species to survive. It's adaptation at its best. So this notion that we're all driven by external reward systems is an incredible simplification about who we are biologically, biomechanically. Um, it's almost like we have this fear that people with disabilities are, doing everything they can to get as much reinforcement out of us as they possibly can. I always have this image of people with disabilities being in smoke-filled rooms at night going, one thing that really screws them up is if you bang your head on things, they'll give you all kinds of attention for that. I found that running out into traffic randomly is a big help. It's almost like we have this idea that people are involved in this kind of calculus to get as much reward as possible. It's just nonsensical. So being in relationship with people, being nurturing and help them when they reach out is critical. That's everybody who's in this forum today. My bet is that's what you've learned over your lifetime. What's been reinforced over your lifetime is this notion that reaching out pays off. You've had experience after experience where someone was there when you needed them. They helped you to put things back together when things fell apart. And that the more that is experienced by the organism, the stronger it becomes over time. And the problem for too many people who we care about is that they just don't have a lot of experience in which reaching out has actually been beneficial. Many people I know in my practice were separated from their primary relationships at an early age. We used to think that was a good idea, but it never was a good idea, nor will it ever be a good idea. It's abuse. We traumatized hundreds of thousands of little boys and girls who experience disabilities in North America by forcing their families to make this impossible decision that you want help for your kid, you have to send them away. And if you don't send them away, no help for you. We put them in isolated classrooms and schools instead of being part of their communities. They're separate from their communities. I don't need to go on, I'm sure, with this group today about the history of exclusion of people with disabilities. What we know about people that are socially connected is that they live longer and happier lives as a whole. They get sick less often, and when they do get sick, they get better faster. What we know about people who are socially connected is that they are more likely to take medication as prescribed. They're less likely to have underlying mental health issues, less likely to have problem behaviors. It's not even a close horse race with people who are lonely. Another way of saying it is that people who are lonely don't live as long typically. They don't find as much happiness and meaning. They get sick more often. When they do get sick, it takes them longer to recover. They're less likely to take medication as prescribed, more likely to have underlying mental health issues and problem behaviors. That's what we've been, saying about people with disabilities for decades now, is that they don't live as long as people typical in their development. They get sick more often. When they do, it takes them longer to recover. They don't take medication as prescribed. They're more likely to have underlying mental health issues and problem behaviors. We've been saying it for decades as if it's an artifact of the experience of disability itself. I think it's more an artifact of being on the outside of what is in. It's not a person's experience with disability that is the root of their suffering, but rather the isolation that often occurs for people who experience disabilities that is at the root of their suffering. So we're back to that question about that kid on the porch who hits himself. Now, if I could go back, I wish I could, I would immediately express concern and come to him. And if he was going to whack himself again, I might try to stop his arm from hitting his head. I might have pillows available that I put up so he doesn't hurt himself. I'd say, what's up? How can I help? What do you need? If he wanted something, I'd help him with it. I'd tell him, I'm so glad you're letting me know what you need, and anything I could do to help. I'd offer to get him some soda pop or something if that would taste good. There'd be no part of me now This is one of the questions that was asked, what do I know now that I wish I'd known back then? There'd be absolutely no part of me that would worry that I'm reinforcing the wrong behavior. I would be nurturing and helpful. I would be saying, yep, this strategy of reaching out and looking for some help from another person is a really good option. And I'm pretty confident that that acting out or the shutting down that sometimes results would just not occur, because he would learn, I'm in a jam. I can depend on David to help me through.
I think that answers it really nicely, David. Thanks. So we have another question that says, so when you meet or see an individual who has lots of energy and exhibits quote unquote behaviors, could that often be an indication that they are actually experiencing higher levels of anxiety? And if so, would that suggest that a helpful approach would be to support the individual to feel safe and secure, and also to help to develop strategies to feel more secure in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question and comment. Now, people can have a lot of energy in their body for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes it's not bad at all. It's just how they're hardwired. But sometimes excess amounts of energy inside the body are really just an expression of too much anxiety. And the kinds of things that typically help are the things that won't surprise any of you. Among them, for people to have a sense of order and place. What are we doing? What's the next thing that's going to happen? Who's going to be with me today? What do I have input into the planning? Is my voice being heard? A really helpful thing, we talked about it a little before, is for people to move aerobically. Anything that can help get the heart rate up and sustain it for even short periods of time, like 20 minutes, can do the body a world of good. Swimming, if you use a wheelchair, transferring in and out of a pool, or even transferring a lot throughout the day because you're going and doing different things, all helps to get the heart rate up. Sustaining it for even short periods of time just has huge impact on the central nervous system, calming it down. So I work with a lot of people of different ages. Sometimes they're kids, and when I'm working with kids that are in the stratosphere in terms of anxiety, among the first things I want to do is to try to wear them out. Al Vecchione, the guy, I'll show you his website in a little bit. He works a lot with kids, and when kids come to school in the morning, Al will sometimes hire aides to work with them who are kind of athletic people. And he'll say, play with the kid in the playground for, a half an hour until you're worn out, and then go another half hour. Because his goal is to wear kids out, dampen down this excess arousal in their body. When they're in that place, they cope better, they make better decisions, they don't act out as often. In fact, a way to think about people acting out is that they are self-medicating for too much energy in their bodies sometimes. The tantrum itself helps dampen down that excess arousal in the body. Al says, you don't have to wait for that. Do things that help the person to be as active as possible. Dampen down excess arousal is the clinical term, but it's a really sensible thing for people to do. Aerobic activity is among the most effective things to do for people who have anxiety or depression, minor or major. It's one of the most effective things you can do.
And I think, given what you just said, I think you've kind of answered this, but if you have anything to add, it says, do you have any tips on how can we help an individual meet both their optimum level of arousal and optimum level of anxiety? In my experience, getting closer instead of further oftentimes helps.
So if a person is upset about something, that just moving towards them helps? Is that what you mean, Heather?
I think it's more like how you can meet them, get into that optimal zone. And I think that's what you were talking about around, making sure that they can wear off some of that energy, engaging with them instead of that turning your back and maybe walking away, or assuming that they can sit it out or do some of those other things. But it sounds like I'll ask if you answer that, but I think you probably answered this question with some of your others.
Well, one thing. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, one thing I would just maybe add into it that might help get at that, if I understand it, is that a way to think about human beings is that we're, in fact, a way to think about any living thing, any organism that is alive on the planet. It is constantly in search of homeostasis. And homeostasis is a term that means we're in an optimal place for growth and resilience. So the way I think about it is it's like a plant that is on a forest floor that has a lot of cover over it, a lot of other bigger trees growing, for example, around it. And this plant, this seedling, will lay down roots that optimize its ability to withdraw from the soil nutrients it needs to grow. The roots themselves will turn and shift and grow in different directions based on the moisture content, the nutrient content of the soil. And as it sprouts out of the ground to achieve sun that it needs, it will change its shape, sometimes quite dramatically, because there may not be enough sunlight coming through the cover. And so it shifts and turns until it finds an optimal place to grow. You can walk through a forest and see trees that have been trying this for 100 years or more, and then new seedlings that are practicing it in the first year of their existence. It's called homeostasis, getting to that optimal place of growth. In humans, we do the same thing. We're often on a cellular level, we're programmed to find an optimal place of growth. And you might say to get to that place of right anxiety. It's like on a cellular level, we're kind of searching that out every day. This is why if we lack sleep the night before, we drink lots of coffee from Tim's and maybe grab a donut or two for some sugar to get our system energized, and then we fall off the face of the earth later in the day and try other strategies to get it. But it's all an attempt to get us back to this kind of optimal place. I think it's the root of, or a big part of what drug addiction is about, is people get that initial first high, and everything they do from that point out is to try to achieve that high again, which often they never will. But a way to view people when they are really anxious in their bodies is that everything they're doing is some attempt by the body to get itself back to homeostasis. So I meet people all the time who are really anxious in their bodies, and they're doing, let's say, the same thing over and over again. Like my friend Eric puts a video of a Disney movie in and out of a machine repeatedly. People have ways that they vibrate in their body or self-stimulate in their body. All kinds of things people are doing, and one way to view that is that it's all an attempt to manage their own anxiety, to better self-regulate. So a way of thinking about people is that they already found some brilliant ways to manage what is more anxiety than I experience on some of my worst days. They're actually good at managing anxiety, and everything that they're doing during the course of the day, especially things they're doing over and over again, are all designed to help them get to this sort of sweet spot. So one is to appreciate that people do these things because it helps them to self-regulate, and then know that a big part of the work is help them find other strategies that are as useful or even more useful potentially than the strategies they have. I don't know if that's made any sense at all, but hopefully
so. And I have three more. I know we were going to take a break shortly, but I have three quick ones. One says, I'm sitting here participating in this meeting, and you could be talking about my own experience. Wish I knew then what I'm learning now. I could have been so much more efficient in the front lines. So thank you.
So welcome. Thank you.
We have a yes. We support complex individuals. Moving closer. Thank you. And then the question before that you had asked, she said yes. Thank you. That answers answered some of the questions. And then we have somebody who says, Darcy, who says, can you speak further to supporting a child exhibiting self-harming behavior?
Sure. And I realize, Heather, that in my long explanation about homeostasis, I forgot about that part of the question is moving closer where that person tends to help. What I've learned, and I'll answer this quickly, I promise it won't go on quite so long, but I've learned that it works differently for different people. So some people, me moving towards them and helping them really helps them settle down. And then other people, me moving too close during times like that can make them further aroused. So what you want to do is take your cues from the person. If moving away for a little while and giving them a break is helpful, you might say, come back and check and see if you're okay. If that tends to help the person calm down, then by all means, let that be what you do. If moving towards the person is helpful and nurturing, then by all means, let that be the move. Now, regarding self-injurious behavior, I spent a lot of time in my career thinking about this and helping people who do things that are hurtful to themselves. In fact, my doctoral research was about self-injurious behavior. A couple things about it. One is that when people tell me someone is banging their head, I want them to be specific about what part of the head they're banging. Or if they say they're hurting themselves, how do they hurt themselves? Exactly what is it that they do? He bites his wrist, or he hits his legs hard with his fists. I'm really curious to know what part of the body the person's hurting. The reason for that is often people are hurting a part of their body that hurts. So if you've ever had a toothache, you know that sometimes you find yourself biting down on your tooth, which intensifies the pain momentarily, but then it's followed by relief. And an idea here is that human beings, when they're experiencing pain, if they have two choices, one to intensify the pain, if that helps them get control over the pain, that's what they'll do. To be out of control, just experiencing pain without being able to affect its intensity at all is the most debilitating. So it's not uncommon for human beings to hurt a part of their body that hurts. If you've ever had eczema or some kind of skin condition, you know how hard it is not to itch it, but you're programmed to intensify the pain because you'll get momentary relief. It's also important to know that pain doesn't always localize. So the first question I ask is it possible the part of the body that the person's hurting hurts? Then I try to remember that pain doesn't always localize. So someone might be hitting their ear because they have an earache in one case. Another person could be hitting their ear because they have a tooth that's erupting. And pain sometimes radiates to different parts of the body from its source. People who are constipated may be banging their head against the wall. You don't eliminate or you don't stop thinking about a physical source of the problem because you can't zero in on a local reason for it happening, but that's a good place to start. The next thing to know is that sometimes what starts off as having a physical source takes on social meaning. So a story I often tell people, and I promise to take a break soon, but story I often tell is one time I was supporting a mom and her son, and he was a sweetheart. He used a little wheelchair, and he didn't have a very sophisticated form of communication, but he would make noises, and his mom, she knew what his noises meant. So he could make one sound, and she'd know he wanted to get something to drink from the refrigerator, and he could make to what my ear sounded like exactly the same sound. and she'd know he needed some help repositioning himself in his chair. She just was tuned right into him. Well, one day she called me up and she was in a panic. And she said, he's hitting his ear. He's hitting his ear. You've got to come and help. He's hitting his ear. What do I do? What do I do? And she said, it's not going to turn out to be that self-injurious behavior. He's not going to have that, is he? You got to help me. You got to help. And I promised her that I would come. But I said, first, if you could bring him to the pediatrician, his pediatrician, and have them look for an ear infection. I said, make sure they really get a good look at him, because he was one of these little guys who moved around in his wheelchair a lot. Might have to hold on to him, get him to doc to look. And sure enough, she took him to the pediatrician, and sure enough, he had an ear infection. It was red, red, red. And the pediatrician treated it with something, I think it was an antibiotic or something, because he got better fast. He got much better fast. But even after the course of that treatment, whatever it was, I think it was a medication, he continued from time to time to hit his ear. And the reason for this is because what started out as having a physical cause took on social meaning. What this little boy, who didn't have a very elaborate communication system at the time, had learned was, man, when I go like this, mama stops whatever she's doing and comes running. So it had power to it. And we taught him a communication system that a protocol that I would use, or a way to decide what to teach people for communication to replace behavior like that, is that it has to be as efficient and effective as whatever the behaviors you're trying to replace. So think about the number of calories you need to expend to raise your hand to your head and hit your ear. And it's very efficient. It's not complicated at all. But often the mistake we make is when we teach a replacement communication skill, it's so complicated and convoluted, it's ridiculous. So we've got the kid now having to sign in a bunch of different ways, or point to a communication board, say something to the effect of, Mom, I know you're busy right now, but if you have a chance, could you get me, a drink out of the refrigerator, particularly one with a low glycemic index? I mean, we make these communication strategies so complicated. You have to start with things that are as efficient and effective as the behavior you want to replace. So we got him a little device on his wheelchair that he'd click, and a little chime would go off and a little light would light up. And basically the first thing we taught him is, you click this button and your mom will stop whatever she's doing and come running. And once that was really clear to him that would work, then it turned into a more sophisticated communication system, and it is to this day very complicated communication system he has on his computer that works unbelievably. But I tell you that because what started out as having a physiological cause took on social meaning. And also remember that it can be both. So we had to say to this mom, look, if he suddenly starts really hurting himself again, make sure you get to the pediatrician sooner, not later. Don't wait around, because sometimes with some kids, they get one ear infection and then more will follow. And that turned out to be true for him, actually. So no point in wasting time calling me on the phone, get him to the pediatrician's office and have him look for the ear infection, treat it. And he's since grown out of them, thankfully. But for a little while there, it was understanding that it was both social and physiological. One does not eliminate the other.